Proud Boys leader Enrique Tarrio sentenced to 22 years over January 6th riot. How's it going, guys? Welcome to Unwoke Thoughts. Tonight, we are going to be talking about Enrique Tarrio, the former chairman of the Proud Boys, who has been sentenced to 22 years on charges of seditious conspiracy related to the January 6th, 2021 U.S. Capitol riot, making it the lengthiest sentence given to any defendant for the events of that day. And despite Tarrio's absence, let me reiterate that Enrique Tarrio wasn't at the Capitol on the day of the riot, and the court enhanced his sentence on the grounds of terrorism. Tarrio's co-defendants, also Proud Boys affiliates, received sentences ranging from 15 to 18 years. Over 1,100 people so far have been charged in relation to the Capitol riot, with more than 300 already sentenced. And Tarrio, out of all of them, he has the longest sentence despite his absence, 22 years in prison. That's just insane. But new arrests continue more than 2 years post-event. And Tarrio's lawyer has come out with a statement, and he emphasized that his client's intent, Enrique Tarrio's intent, was only to protect the country, even if maybe it was misguided. But today, guys, we're going to be talking about this and reading this article by the Gateway Pundit. The headline reads, "Justice is dead. Proud Boys leader Enrique Tarrio, who was not even in Washington, D.C. on January the 6th, is sentenced to 22 years on seditious conspiracy from a neighboring town somewhere." So let's get into this, guys, and try to figure out why they are charging him with this seditious conspiracy. Is there a justification to this? And where was Enrique Tarrio when the January 6th protest, I call it, went down? But the article reads, on Tuesday, Enrique Tarrio was sentenced to 22 years in prison for running a, quote, seditious conspiracy from a different state somewhere. So that's in bold. He ran a seditious conspiracy from a different state somewhere. I wonder if this article will go into exactly where he was. But Enrique was not in Washington, D.C. on January the 6th. Judge Tim Kelly applied a terrorism enhancement to Enrique Tarrio's sentence earlier in the day. Then Kelly forced Enrique to listen to his blustery nonsense before he was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison, more than a murderer. Now, this was a tweet that was sent out by Kyle Cheney, and he said, happening now, Judge Kelly has applied the terrorism enhancement to Enrique Tarrio's upcoming sentence. Parties are still working through the guidelines. So this was apparently a live tweet, and he must have been there at the courthouse when Enrique Tarrio was charged with this terrorism enhancement, is the term they use here. This article goes on to say there were dozens of feds and FBI agents who infiltrated the Proud Boys in the lead up to January 6th. Now, one of his informants could bring evidence that the group was planning an insurrection. Even the driver who drove Enrique Tarrio over his brief meeting with Stuart Rhodes in a D.C. parking lot was an FBI informant. So apparently, this Proud Boys group was infiltrated, was crawling with feds, FBI informants. And I wonder, I would like to get an answer to exactly how much of a role the FBI informants, how much of a role the feds played in instigating this riot, because when you look at it, it's very, very questionable. And I don't like seeing these feds who go into these groups, who instigate and try to cause people to compromise themselves in these ways and basically plant false flags. It's just, to me, it just gives me a very sick feeling in the pit of my stomach when I see this type of thing happening, because I don't think this is the way that law enforcement should be acting in a free society. With each new day, we learn the January 6th, quote, insurrection was an FBI setup. What a disgraceful time for America. And, I couldn't agree more. Like I said just a second ago, when I see feds infiltrating these groups, going to these events, going to these protests, and basically instigating, causing stirs, and doing everything they can to turn these events and protests into more serious matters, it disgusts me to the highest level. The only evidence the DOJ discovered against the Proud Boys was planted by an FBI operative in their group chat. Wow. So it seems like the FBI had a pretty large part of what the Proud Boys did at the Capitol that day. I wonder why they aren't going after any of these institutions like the FBI and these intelligence agencies for their part in the January 6th riots. Why aren't they going after them? It doesn't make any sense. On Tuesday, Enrique Tarrio was sentenced to years in prison, 22, for running an insurrection from a different state. Imagine the BS this regime is pumping out to the public on a daily basis. The demented Judge Kelly relished in sentencing Enrique Tarrio to prison for his remaining days for his politics. Kelly forced Tarrio through a struggle session in court on Tuesday. How did this wicked creature ever become a judge? And this is Kyle Cheney tweeting again. Kelly emphasizes that Tarrio being in Baltimore. So Tarrio apparently was in Baltimore at the time of this riot or this protest. So Kelly emphasizes that Tarrio being in Baltimore during January 6th doesn't cut in his fact. And then this is a quote. It did, from his perspective, insulate him in just the way he's arguing now, insulate and distance himself from what unfolded that day. That's useful to someone as smart as Mr. Tarrio. So that must have been a quote from the judge there. And here is a picture of Enrique Tarrio here. He was the leader of the Proud Boys, and picture is captioned, Enrique Tarrio has been sentenced to 22 years in prison. Now, guys, there are many reasons why I disagree with this sentencing. Number one, of course, is the most obvious. He received 22 years, which is the longest sentence for anyone involved in the January 6th protest/riot, even though he was not physically present at the Capitol that day, and his co-defendants who were present received sentences ranging from 15 to 18 years. Now, Joe Biggs was one of these. He received, I believe it was 17 years, and even that, I believe, was extremely heavy-handed because one of Joe Biggs' charges was terrorism, and the justification for that was knocking down a barricade at the Capitol. Now, is that smart? No. Is that criminal? Yes. But 17 years and a charge of terrorism? I don't think any reasonable person would come to that conclusion. Now, in Tarrio's case, the disparity in his sentencing, especially given his absence from the Capitol, raises concern about proportionality and fairness. Now, the other thing I disagree with is the seditious conspiracy charge. The charge of seditious conspiracy is not one that should be applied lightly. Now, I looked into this charge, and it traditionally requires proof of an agreement to use force to overthrow the government or prevent the execution of its laws. And in Tarrio's case, I believe the argument could be made that this charge is excessive given his absence from the Capitol on January 6th. And then, of course, there was the terrorism sentencing enhancement. Now, the judge agreed to apply a terrorism sentencing enhancement in Tarrio's case. This is a designation typically reserved for the most severe and direct acts of terrorism. The use of this enhancement in this context could be considered excessive and could set a concerning legal precedent for future cases that are less severe in nature. Now, lastly, the defense did have an argument in favor of Tarrio, and it was Tarrio's lawyer that pointed out that Tarrio comes from a country where there are no rights and emphasized that his actions, however misguided, were aimed at protecting the country. And the question arises whether the sentence accounts for the complexity of his motivations and background. And of course, finally, this throws into question the rights and freedoms we have as Americans. Now, sentences like this spark debate about civil liberties, freedom of speech, and the right to protest, because if you are someone who pays attention to what is going on in your government, inevitably there's going to be something coming up that you do not like, and you have a right to speak, to protest, to make your voice heard. And while some of the actions of some of the protesters at January 6th were severe, excessive sentencing in response can also pose risks to a democratic society's foundational values. And of course, I'm talking about the United States here. We have foundational values, freedom of speech, the right to protest, freedom of press, all of these things that we hold dear as American citizens. Now, because of these things, I believe there are grounds for questioning the fairness and proportionality of Enrique Tarrio's 22-year prison sentence. The issues surrounding his case point to broader concerns about the American judicial process and the definitions of terrorism and seditious conspiracy and how sentences are determined and applied. But what do you guys think about Enrique Tarrio's sentencing? Do you think that he deserved the 22 years that he was sentenced to? And do you think that Joe Biggs deserved his 17 years that he was sentenced to? What do you think about this charge of seditious conspiracy? And what do you think about this terrorism enhancement that was attached to Enrique Tarrio's case? If you could please leave a comment down in the comment section below, like this video, and subscribe to my channel, I would really appreciate it. But until then, I will see you on the next one.